Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, according to your timetable. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you to the third session of the seminar Traditions of Magic in the Near East and Caucasus, virtually hosted by the Institute for Oriental and Classical Studies of the Higher School for Economics in Moscow. I am very grateful that we will hear today Joanne Skerlock, who is presenting an interesting paper about magic in Mesopotamia. Joanne is one of the few experts in the field of medicine and magic of ancient Mesopotamia. She received her BA and PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago in Assyriology. She published volumes like Diagnosis in Assyrian and Babylonian Medicine, Magical Medical Means of Treating Ghost-Induced Illnesses in Ancient Mesopotamia, and a source book for ancient Mesopotamian medicine, just to mention some of her many publications. I'm very happy to have her here today, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. If you have questions or remarks, I think it will be the best if you just type them in the chat so that we can discuss them after the lecture. Joanne, welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Okay, we are shared. No distinction can be made between ancient Mesopotamian magic and religion along the lines proposed by Sir James Frazer and still quoted in the literature, even by those who think that they have exorcised his ghost. Natural magic, which is what Frazer described with its principles of homeopathy and contagion and its automatic results, is an invention of Hellenistic Greek philosopher-scientists. The magic of actual practitioners of magic, with the exception of the European Renaissance magico-philosophers, upon whose practices Frazer based his definition of magic, was not natural magic, it was demonic magic. This was never automatic because it required the cooperation of listening spirits with minds of their own. Ancient Mesopotamians lived in what Marshall Solons has termed an enchanted world. Everything had a spirit. At the top were the great gods, one of whom served as head of pantheon. Beneath them were lesser divinities who served as viziers, gate openers, scribes, and other attendants to the great gods. There were also demons who were sometimes in the employ of gods, as was the prosecuting attorney demon, and sometimes corruptly freelanced to inflict illness in hopes of extorting a handout. Somewhat overlapping with this category are the ghosts of the dead. Okay, just a minute. Okay. Some of these, as for example, the male Lilu and the female Lilitu and Ardut Lily, were once living persons who had died without knowing the joys of marrying and having children. These unhappy spirits preyed vampire-like on young persons of the opposite sex who wasted away and died, swelling the numbers of these demons by position. Other ghosts could be persuaded by evil people to inflict harm, and there were beggar ghosts who could legitimately pester the living to provide the necessary sustenance in their netherworld prison. Further down the ladder of being, there were the spirits of animals, the horse, the lion, and the bull, all the way down to the tiniest insect. Even further down were the spirits of plants, particularly those with medicinal uses. Scraping the bottom were what we would consider inanimate objects, including buildings, weapons, clay pits, and even rocks. Any or all of these might be addressed in the course of a ritual and expected to understand, however dimly, what was being said to them. So, for example, a door could be encouraged. A dog could be protected. Try this again. A door could be protected by real dogs, encouraged in their activities by dog charms. miniature dogs of clay, beautifully represented. These had instructions written on them and were buried under the threshold. One of these instructions reads, "Don't take it over, bite." At the other end of the spectrum, there's a treatment for fever, in which a salve is made by mixing dust from various locations and a medicinal plant with oil and boiling them in a stone vessel. Into this boiling mixture, a hapless live lizard was thrown. To ensure the efficacy of the resulting salve, there was a recitation citing magical analogies directed to the dust. As for example, the dust from the sunlight in the shade was told, "Shade brings shade in proportion to the heat of the sunlight." And plaster from both doorposts that just as one doorpost may never approach the other, so may the illness never approach the patient. Interaction between human beings and spirits in the ancient Near East was readily divisible into two unequal parts. Of these, one part, which we might term religion, was God-centered. The focus was what a particular god might want or need, or what would keep him or her happy and well-disposed towards the community as a group. This might include maximally a house, a statue which was washed and dressed, a wife living in the same temple, family and friends in temples in neighboring cities to whom visits could be paid, the regular offering of twice daily meals, and periodic festivals and processions. In charge of these services for the gods was the priest, the Shangu. The other part, by contrast, which we might term magic, was man-centered. Its focus was on the needs of the individual members of the community, particularly for healing. Spirits were distinguished from gods in having no regular cult. This placed them in the position of having to be satisfied with occasional offerings that propitiated them and or transferred the problem to them and or bound them by contract to go away and never come back again. In charge of these man-oriented services was the Ashipu, about whom more presently. There are no special terms in either for religion or magic in Acadia. Between religion and magic, there was no source of conflict. On the contrary, the fact that they were priests to keep gods happy and well-fed served to provide a mailing address for important members of the pantheon to keep them, as it were, on retainer for the private needs of the human community. Thus, religion made magic possible, and magic made religion necessary. This close relationship may be illustrated at both ends of the spectrum. The Ashipu, although more usually seen performing man-centered rites, was a member of the temple establishment, and his services were not inessential. Not only was he the one who purified the temple at its annual house cleaning, but when a new statue had to be made, it was he who convinced the divinity that his new body was indeed his, including a directly magical rite in which the marks of the craftsman's tools were removed by in miniature, along with a tigress turtle of silver and a Euphrates turtle of gold into the thigh of a sacrificed sheep, which was then thrown into the river, carrying off all signs of human craftsmanship as it went. Conversely, it was possible for a private individual to piggyback his own magical ritual onto a publicly performed religious festival. We shall see a quite nefarious use of piggybacking much later. The most common use of magic was in healing the sick. Two experts could be appealed to for this purpose in ancient Mesopotamia. One of these, the Asu, was a plant expert whose treatments were supplemented by amulets and recitations, for the most part addressed to lower order spirits, including those of the medicines being employed. He was not, contrary to what you may have heard, a sort of scientist, in contrast to his colleague, the Ashipu, all too often called a magician or even a sorcerer. There was no more conflict in ancient Mesopotamia between science and religion, or between science and magic, than there was between magic and religion. What distinguishes the two healing professionals was that the Ashipu was qualified by specialist training to diagnose illness and to prescribe treatments. The diagnostic system was a flexible one, allowing for both what we would consider to be natural and supernatural causes. In addition to malfunctioning body parts and specially named syndromes, the quote-unquote natural causes, ancient Mesopotamians attributed diseases to the baleful influence of gods, ghosts, demons, and witchcraft. These supernatural causes were not part of a separate system of diagnosis and treatment. but on the contrary, behaved in exactly the same way as the natural causes. The Ashipu's magical expertise allowed for elaborate rituals, giving instructions to both illness inflictor and medicines in Akkadian, Sumerian, and spirit talk, what we call Vok's Magikai, accompanied by sign language for really stupid spirits. Also included might be prayers with sacrifice to the gods who were supposed to act as guarantors of the right, making sure that the treatment worked. Nonetheless, that it was the medicine, however strongly it might need to be persuaded, and not the words or ritual actions themselves that were producing the results in such cases, is actually spelled out in an ancient Mesopotamian recitation. The she-goat is yellow. Her kid is yellow. Her shepherd is yellow. Her chief herdsman is yellow. She eats yellow grass on the yellow ditch bank. She drinks yellow water from the yellow ditch. He threw a stick at her, did not turn her back. He threw a clod at her, didn't raise her head. He threw at her a mixture of thyme and salt, and the bile began to dissolve like the mist. For this reason, the Ashipu had to hand any number of treatments, both his own and those supplied by his colleague, the Ashu, that required nothing but the medicine itself. So if you were a poor man, you only had to pay for the medicine. And if you were worried wealth, you could get the whole 9 yards. This was the patient's choice. Spirits inflicting illness, as for example, the ghost who was responsible for migraines, could be dealt with by apotropaion, that is, wearing some sort of protective amulet that kept them at bay. If it was too late for that, there was propitiation, transfer, or exorcism, sometimes all at once. So let's suppose that you were experiencing disaster in the stables, with horses sick with a disease that changed the color of their dung and that made them give birth to dead or sickly foals. Okay, first order business was to rub all of the horses in the stable with the medicinal salve. That done, you were ready for the magic. Once horses were all salved up, 7 reed altars were erected, one each to a series of Sumerian divinities. Enki, god of wisdom; Utu, sun god and god of justice; Asaluki, god of healing, the personal god and goddess of the stable owner; Ninsun, mother of Gilgamesh; and Chakan, her husband, the last 2 being patrons of the herds. Each of these divinities, and the accompanying Sumerian or Sumero-Akkadian bilingual recitations were meant to alert to the problem, got the god's share of a sacrificed sheep, a leg, caul fat, and part of the roasted meat. This was in consideration of their acting as guarantors of the right. Strikingly, the female of the family goats, also got kispu offerings indicative of their role in herding away the disease-causing demons to the netherworld. The site for the ritual was prepared by putting down reed shutuku huts and erecting an uri galu standard. A pit was dug before the shutuku huts. A virgin she-goat was tied up and thrown into the pit, her escape route being blocked by laying pieces of wood across the entrance. She was destined quite literally as a scapegoat, an absorbing pad for evils to be transferred into her from the horses. Come nightfall, the horses were made to pass over the makeshift cover, hopefully leaving their troubles and not themselves in the pit with the goat. To make sure, 3 adult male goats, one for each of the watches of the night, were sequentially passed by the horses, along with 3 different types of ritual drum and appropriate fumigants. Last but not least, the horses were purified using water from the holy water basin. As with much later magical traditions, it was not unusual for historioli to be attached. Most commonly, these take the form of what is called the Marduk-Ea formula, in which the god Marduk is supposed to have noticed a particular problem and goes to his father Ea for guidance, and Ea first says, "What do I know that you do not know?" and then tells him exactly what to do. However, there are several quite magnificent examples of more interesting themes, including a sort of creation narrative involving a worm that causes tooth decay. My personal favorite is the cow of sin, which goes as follows. There was once a cow, so alluring that the moon god himself became enamored of her. One cow of sin, Maid of Sin was her name. She was richly adorned. She was luxuriant in shape. Sin saw her and loved her. They pastured her among the juiciest grasses. They gave her water to drink and the most satisfying of watering places. Concealed from the herd boy, without the herdsman seeing, a vigorous fat bull mounted the cow. He reared up over her tail. Now, this was all invisible, so nobody actually knew she was pregnant. So when time to give birth drew near, the poor cow was terrified and her herdsman at wit's ends. Fortunately, the moon god heard her cries and sent two protected divinities with charmed oil and water to ease the birth pains and ensure safe and easy delivery of the suckling calf. In real time, the charm part was provided by medicinal herbs. Somewhere between apotropaion and treatment was a class of magic known as the Nomborbi. The idea was to get rid of some horrid disaster or disease of which an omen, either celestial or terrestrial, was the early warning. Fast action on this front, and you could actually prevent the portended evil from happening to you. Shell ducks that had the ill grace to flock over a person's head required capturing a pair of the offending birds. The birds got a nice meal and were released unharmed. But unbeknownst to them, they were the recipients of tainted offerings. Demonic magic does not work unless paid for. However, the acceptance of the payment binds the recipient by quasi-contract to perform what is required of him or her. The quasi-contract may be turned into a real contract by forcing the demon to swear an oath to this effect, a common strategy when the demonic problem causer happened to be a ghost. Moreover, it is not unusual, as with our shell ducks, for the offerings to act as a conduit of transfer, giving the problem being gotten rid of, the bad omen, to the recipient of the offerings, the birds. To accomplish this, the patient was rubbed off with flour mixed with well water, and it was this ill-omened paste that was fed to the birds. And to ensure that the bad omen could not find its way back, the pair of birds were released in opposite directions, with the male to the east and the female to the west. This action was accompanied by a prayer to the sun god Shamash and followed by various purificatory rites. One of the more curious uses of the Nomborbi was to get rid of the ominous consequences of having had sexual intercourse with a goat. For this ritual, you needed to have your recent conquest in hand, since you needed some of her hair for the ritual. Up on the roof before the sun god Shamash, you tethered a goat with whom you had not slept and who was thus still a virgin. Before her, you laid down your girlfriend's hair mixed with hair from a third goat who had to be red so that you had both white and red hair together. Over the hair, you poured a libation of beer, and the arrangement was a silent prayer. As a deflowered female will never be a virgin again, and as the red wool will never become white, so may I and the evil be parted forever. The hair was wrapped up into a linen package on which the deflowerer knelt before Shamash to recite a formula and to report his doings. We would say confess, after which he prostrated himself. The linen package got thrown into the gate of a beer merchant who was expected to experience a diminution in revenue as a result, although the bad consequences of the omen would be averted. As for why the hapless merchant was picked out for a dry spell, his profits came under the purview of the goddess Ishtar, who was closely associated both with intercourse and with goats. More prosaically, one might suppose that it was the beer merchant's merchandise that inspired the act that got the beneficiary of the ritual in trouble in the first place. It did not necessarily follow that all magic was good. In Egypt, magic, Heka, was a free-for-all, with everybody, gods including, used magic against everybody else. In Hatti and Mesopotamia, by contrast, there was the Ashipu, who was entrusted with good magic, and who there was the dreaded practitioner of what the Hittites called Almanzatar, and what was in Akkadian is referred to as Kishbu. And the Ashipu was supposed to protect you in Mesopotamia from all of this sort of machination. Now, sorcery was strictly illegal, okay, but very difficult to prove in a court of law, and so rarely prosecuted. So instead, the putative victim went to the Ashipu and resorted to counter-sorcery. Now, the difference between sorcery and counter-sorcery is always a bit of a knife's edge. All magic, good or bad, involved ritual performances in which legomena, set words, and adromena, set actions, instructed a listening spirit as to what the practitioner wanted to happen, rewarded the spirit for specific performance, and or forced him to comply with the practitioner's wishes. The higher up the spirit ranked in the pecking order, the more politely he was treated, even by legitimate practitioners, as we shall see. However, there were a number of basic differences between legitimate and illegitimate praxis, which the actual examples of counter-magic rituals struggle to maintain. In principle, good magic was defensive, driving off the demon, ghost, or sorcery, which was the cause of a patient's illness. It was also the gift of the gods. So, whatever the true situation, there had to be the pretense that the sorcerer was the aggressor and the counter-sorcerer merely acting in self-defense and using divinely inspired magic to do so. Another difference is, as careful reading reveals, that the sorcerer always and the counter-sorcerer never specifically marks the intended victim of the magic, either with magical material, which could take the form of hair or fingernails, a figurine made to specifications and so forth, or putting the magic someplace where the victim would unwittingly come into contact with it, as, for example, burying it under the threshold of his house. The counter-sorcerer is usually also non-committal as to the sex of the intended victim. So, for example, it was alleged that evil persons had fed figurines of their victims to dogs, pigs, birds, and even fish. We may believe this since counter-witchcraft magic includes instructions to, well, feed the figurines of alleged sorcerers to dogs. Specifically, you were to make 2 figurines of dough, one of a sorcerer and one of a sorceress, and fasten them to 2 separate pieces of bread. The alleged victim was to take one piece in his right hand and the other in his left hand to recite an appropriate recitation, cheerfully wishing, "May dog and bitch tear apart your flesh," and feed them to a male dog and a bitch. We note that our dog feeder made 2 figurines, one male and one female, and just for good measure, fed them to dogs of the opposite sex. The reason for this difference between sorcery and counter-sorcery is that different types of magic and different divine sponsors for this magic are involved. Sorcerers used stupid magic that simply did what it was told and had to be given a full set of directions. The divinities that allegedly sponsored this sort of practice were typically gods of the night in the netherworld, not very bright themselves and sufficiently hungry for offerings that they were easily persuaded to do nefarious deeds, particularly those involving the death of the victim. The counter-sorcerer, by contrast, was imagined as taking his case against the alleged sorcerer to the divine court headed by the sun god of justice, Shamash. Ancient Mesopotamia was a system of justice, not a system of law, and a false accusation bore the same penalty as the alleged crime. What this meant was that if you named your alleged sorcerer to the magic, and it turned out, unbeknownst to you, it was some other person who hated your guts that was plotting your demise, the magic would turn round and you would wind up suffering the very fate you envisaged for the alleged sorcerer. If, however, you were magically wishing harm on whoever was trying to get you, then if nobody was, and nobody was going to suffer any harm. Another way of putting this is that counter-sorcery used justice magic, fully capable of discovering whether there was a crime. If so, who the miscreant was, locating him or her, and delivering appropriate punishment. What was particularly nasty about sorcerers is that they had the power to enlist demons to do to a particular victim whom the sorcerer wished to harm what that demon might have been inclined to do anyway. Classic in this category is the demoness Lamashtu. Lamashtu was a baby-snatching demoness who seems in Jewish folklore to have been crossed with another creature, the Lilitu demoness, producing the Lilith. According to her ancient Mesopotamian backstory, Lamashtu was a daughter of Anu, who got herself thrown out of heaven when she proved to have a taste for human flesh. The daughter of Anu comes before Enlil, her father, crying, "Bring me what I ask of you, my father Enlil." the flesh of mankind, which is not good to eat, the coagulated blood of men. Her problem was that she was a frustrated mother who caused abortions in pregnant women and deaths in young children due to her overeagerness to nurture and suckle babies. The daughter of Anu daily counts the pregnant women. She goes round after those about to give birth. She counts off their months. She marks the days of their confinement onto the wall. For the lying-in woman giving birth, this is her incantation. Bring me your sons so that I can give them suck. Let me put the breast into the mouth of your daughters. I'll be the best wet nurse ever. Yeah, no problem. No such luck. It was hardly surprising that she had no husband or lover to provide her with children of her own, since she was a lion-headed monster with donkey teeth and clawed feet, only slightly redeemed by wings like a Lilitu demon. She also ran around half naked, lived in the swamp, and wore an Elamite topknot when she happened to bother to comb her hair at all. As she was so awful looking, she literally withered trees just by leaning on them. As for what the modern diagnosis for the fever she caused would be, as it can be reconstructed from the ancient Mesopotamian Diagnostic and Prognostic Handbook, most promising is the typhus typhoid group. This accounts for Lamashtu being said to live in the swamp, as well as her characterization as a frustrated mother, since the word for mother is a pun on the word for fever, and the daughter of Anu, the word for daughter in Akkadian being the same or pun on the word for jaundice. As for her predilection for pregnant women and young children, this may have been an attempt to distinguish typhus from typhoid, since the two diseases have significantly different mortality rates in children and in the likelihood of a pregnant woman losing her fetus. And yes, they had treatments for it. Most interesting for us are several texts in which the suspicion is that an alcoholic patient who has contracted a fever has been the victim of witchcraft. In these alleged rites, the patient was made febrile through the rituals of a sorcerer or sorceress who made figurines of him, clothed them with combed out hair, covered their faces with sheep bile, and pierced them with a date palm thorn so as to produce the hair fall, the vomiting, and the aches and pains of the fever. To ensure that this would result in fatality, not unlikely outcome for such a patient, the evil enemy allegedly also manufactured figurines of the patient at the beginning of Abu in anticipation of one of the 4 annual visits by ghosts at the end of that month. With the arrival of the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of Halloween, these figurines were handed over to Gilgamesh, one or more of the visiting ghosts of Abu, and or the ghost of the patient's relatives, and made to cross the Hubur River to the netherworld on the 29th of Abu, with the ghosts returning to the netherworld at that point. Having once made this journey, the victim could never return to the land of the living, except as a ghost. Gilgamesh was a semi-legendary heroic early king of Uruk, who after death lived on as the constellation Orion, and as one of the judges of the netherworld, in which capacity he brought up the dead once a year in Abu to help celebrate his festival, and then escorted them back home again. He presided over a court consisting of the gods of the lower world, the Anunnaki. Since the 26th of Abu, now remember they go home on the 29th, since the 26th of Abu was the day the Anunnaki made their decisions, the victim of such a rite was pretty much doomed to die. So, what to be done? Situation was not hopeless, but it was not going to be easy. The general idea was clear enough. Key was the reversal of the spell, so as to counter-inflict Lamashtu on the sorcerer or sorceress in a classic tit-for-tat. But the sorcerer or sorceress had managed not merely to enlist Lamashtu and her partner in crime, anything evil, but to suborn Gilgamesh, the Anunnaki, the patient's personal fate demon Nomtar, and a small army of goats, all of whom had to be turned around and recommissioned against the miscreant. Swirling round the key section of the Dromina, which took the form of a very elaborate series of marriage rituals, are partially preserved instructions for the manufacture and manipulation of the requisite figurines of suborned netherworld denizens. First order business was to engage Gilgamesh. As divine judge of the netherworld, his cooperation was essential for the ritual. In addition to dressing him in a manner appropriate to his rank, The patient was to give him, quote, ransom money in order to free himself from the sorcerer's alleged dedication of the patient's figurine to Shamash. This is a quote unquote gold ransom to join a later quote unquote silver ransom paid directly to anything evil. The specification of a shekel weight, that is gintu in Akkadian, was Sumerian, for one of the presents is probably a reference to the Sumerographic writing of Gilgamesh's name, which has the gintu sign, as you can see in the middle. Again, there he is. Okay, if you can see my cursor. The 7 grains of gold and 7 grains of silver that made up this gold ransom, and the fact that the description takes up the first 14 lines of text are probably an indication of the netherworld, whose number was 14. There was also to be a miniature cedar boat with a cypress oar, which was of the large cargo boat variety for use later in the ritual when it came time to make the sorcerer and sorceress cross the Fubor. The Fubor was the river of the netherworld, the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of the Greek Styx. In our ritual, an ordinary river was being used as a stand-in. To make sure that it understood what was expected of it, a recitation was delivered to it, with Gilgamesh as witness, his figurine being turned to face it for the purpose. The idea was the river to carry off anything evil in the form of a figurine made from clay, taken from a potter's pit on the river's bank. Since magic will not work unless it is paid for, the grains of silver that were poured into the potter's pit were to reimburse the river banks for clay taken from them for this purpose. The remainder of the recitation is a pretty description of objects thrown into the river being turned this way and that, and eventually being carried away by the current, never to return. The next order of business was to make a figurine of Nomtar, every person's personal fate demon, to whom the sorcerer and sorceress was to be entrusted. He was represented as a tall, lion, human-headed figure, distinguished from Pazuzu, whom I'm actually showing there, by being given a red face and body and yellow cat's eyes. His job was to act as helmsman on this little boat. Next to be made were figurines of the key participants in the ritual, anything evil, and the figurines of the alleged sorcerer and sorceress. No mention is made of a figurine of Lamashtu, for the probable reason that this was not necessary, since most houses will have had an amuletic plaque on which she was very clearly represented. Anything evil got a figurine dressed in everyday clothes, plus shoes, a bag for the travel flour with which he was to provision Lamashtu, and a water skin, a good indication that the two of them were destined for a long journey together. Anything evil also received the patient's silver ransom money, actually bits of all sorts of metals and stones, plus 3 colors of wool. The figurine of sorcerer and sorceress were the standard clay man and woman, labeled on their left shoulders with sorcerer or sorceress who bewitched so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and so-and-so. In the alleged original rite, the patient's figurine, marked by his spittle, hair, fingernails, bits of his garment, dirt from his tracks, was married to anything evil. In the counter rite, the patient is careful to be as unspecific as possible, making both male and female figurines and labeling them simply as those sorcerers who have afflicted the patient. For the ritual itself, the patient needed to be isolated and on top of the roof, which was where the ceremony was to take place. A prayer was recited at this point to Shamash. His role as god of justice was to see to it that justice was done in this case. There followed a prayer to Gilgamesh. That's a very interesting prayer because it's typical for magical text and a good indication of the close interface between magic and religion. We have an isolated tablet containing only this prayer that, according to its colophon, was copied, checked, and collated by none other than the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, who trusts in Ashur and Melissu, and whom Nabu and Tashmetu endowed with broad understanding. The purpose of the exercise was for this tablet to be kept in his palace for his own reading and to have it read to him. The colophon ends with a short prayer. He who trusts in you shall not come to shame, O king of the gods, Ashur. You cannot imagine the thrill I felt when I held that tablet in my hands. Interesting, in view of later tradition, is to see Gilgamesh referred to in this prayer as a watcher. Originally, a reference to judicial investigations performed as Orion in the night sky. which for ancient Mesopotamia was an extension of the netherworld. Gilgamesh, as judge, is described in this prayer using two terms, one of which is actually Hebrew, and the other of which is Akkadian. The Hebrew word is the word for judge, and the Akkadian word, which goes into Hebrew, actually is a loan word, refers to that part of the judicial process which involves assessing the penalty, deciding whether it was wrong, and all that sort of thing. So that is, I would argue, the ancestor of the term Pharisee. Like Shamash, Gilgamesh's role was a guarantor of the right, with direct action on his part taking the form of pacifying the unhappy family ghosts and rendering the judgment that allowed the illness to be removed and the sorcerer and sorceress to be punished, for which services he was entitled to a libation with reverence. Having set the stage, we are ready for the key part of the ritual, in which the sorcerer and sorceress are married to anything evil and anything evil to Lamashtu with the help of a skull. This skull that was picked up from the ground for this purpose was to be washed and anointed with oil. That done, Lamashtu was to be seated as a witness to the ritual, indicating her awareness of and acquiescence in the proceedings. Anything evil, represented by his figurine, dressed in his everyday clothes and his various accoutrements, was to contribute the patient's silver ransom money, those bits of all sorts of metal and stones, plus the 3 colors of wool. These last formed a sort of fringed hem that was fastened to the skull, and into which the bits of metal and stones and the 2 figurines of the sorcerer and sorceress were to be tied. The tying of the 2 hems was the classic ceremony of marriage in ancient Mesopotamia. So far, we have married anything evil to the figurines of the sorcerer and sorceress, as required by our tit-for-tat reversal of the alleged original sorcery. It remains for anything evil to be married directly to Lamashtu. So we gather the entangled figurines into the skull and seal it up with shigushu flour, a special offering for ghosts, and it becomes anything evil's dowry for his marriage to Lamashtu. So Lamashtu is seated again to receive 2 clay donkeys with travel provisions, her typical presents of housewifely items, a seal, a headdress of green apple-colored wool, and clothing, but with the addition of a silver ring and a grain of silver, plus some kispu offerings. And this is no ordinary marriage. We need to grasp the significance of anything's evil, actual ransom money being bound into the skull's hem. The reference is to the part of a marriage ceremony in which the bride had the bride price returned to her by her father as a sort of indirect dowry. So it is anything evil who has gotten a bride price and is having to counter with a dowry. In short, despite the fact that Lamashtu is a sort of woman and anything evil a sort of man, she is playing the role of husband and he that of the wife. This could happen in the ancient Near East and was particularly common among Hittites and Assyrians. Hittites called it antiant. The normal marriage payments were reversed, and what we would call the husband moved in with what we would call the bride and became part of her family. Again, the reverse of the usual situation. In this case, the moving of the couple into her house was literally going to come to pass, since Lamashtu's home was in the Elamite swamp, which was where the figurines would eventually end up after they were dumped in the river. Okay, we're not quite finished yet because there are a few other people who need to be bought off or persuaded to cooperate. They receive, as you shall see, as you can see here, a differential set of thank yous then depending upon the rank of the spirit in the pecking order. So the Anunnaki get a nice prayer. The family ghosts get an offering of fresh water. The strange ghosts, represented by the skull, and the demon Nomtar, 4 stones. Okay. And last but not least, you have the dispatch. So everything was collected together. So you've got the final dispatch of the skull and its contents, plus anything evil, the little clay donkeys, et cetera, and you load them into your little cedar boat model, which is of the cargo variety, so it's big enough to hold them. It was the custom on the 29th of Abu for the visiting ghosts to be sent off in little boats loaded with food offerings downriver to the netherworld. Our little cedar boat will have joined this miniature navy to float this way and that, with Gilgamesh as ship's captain and Nomtar as steersman manning the cypress oar, in order to send off the lot of them with the departing ghosts. Okay. Between the two extremes of healing magic and sorcery, there was an intermediate category of conditional magic, which required the assisting spirit to punish a specified person if he did something he was not supposed to do or failed to do something he was. This sort of magic was used to enforce international treaties as follows. First, you gathered the oath takers and read out to them the terms of the agreement, both what they were required to do and what they were required not to do. Then you enacted a series of conditional curses in their presence, after which the group was to say amen. Now, some of these sound reasonably harmless. So this is from the Esarhaddon Succession Treaty. Just as a snake and a mongoose cannot live in the same hole, so may you and your wife bicker continually. But it gets pretty grim. Just as this ewe has been cut open and the flesh of her young has been placed in her mouth, may the oath gods make you eat in your hunger the flesh of your brothers, your sons, and your daughters. Last but not least, great gods of the pantheon were invoked to inflict divine punishments on the oath breakers. We may imagine the feelings of the oath takers who were watching and listening as it was graphically explained to them and to the divine enforcers of the oath in both deed and word what was to happen should they violate their oaths. Another use of conditional magic was to control bad behavior, as in the snake and the mongoose living in the same hole between spouses. Love magic, prone to serious misuse, ensured that a young couple joined together by arranged marriage might eventually come to love one another. Among the corpus of ancient Mesopotamian magical texts to be found a series of rituals which were, as they themselves tell us, designed to help a litigant win his legal case. They are called Egal Kura, entering the palace rituals. Now, as you can see, there's a bit of slippery slope problem here. Entering the palace rituals had a specific public use, and that was to be performed on behalf of officials who had literally to enter the palace as part of their official duties. Okay, in this context, the idea was to protect the office holder from possible slander, which could cost him not only his job, but his life. For more private use, there was a wide variety of possibilities that are outlined in this thing. Okay, so you can prevail over your enemy in legal case. You can have what you say heard. You can make your speech pleasant if you have to talk to a courtier, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have God, king, magnate, et cetera, fall, who are judging your case, take pity on you as if you were the father who engendered you and the mother who gave you birth. And whoever looks upon you is supposed to be glad to see you. You're always safe. You don't ever have to worry. You can have whatever you want. You can get your will and everything you wish. And this is getting nasty, to have your bread offerings be loved and those of your legal opponent hated by the gods. Okay, so that whatever you say may be fulfilled and whatever you say can be agreed upon. And you're clear to blame no matter how guilty you were. Okay. Also, you will have good dreams, and there are a few other things that are not mentioned in this particular things, like having restored profit and grown-up sons and daughters. Okay. Like love magic, with which there is actually some not insignificant overlap, entering the palace rituals clearly tiptoe the line between socially accepted and socially sanctioned magical practices. Okay, now you might think, okay, sure, the practitioner thinks what he's doing is okay, and the victim of it is completely convinced that it's sorcery. That's not so simple. Things are not so simple as all that. Okay, the Ashipu did not presume to judge the actual facts of the matter before him. What he did was to provide assistance that attempted to help the client in such a way as to provide relief, but at the same time, and not always, as we shall see, with the best of success, to keep him from teetering off the knife's edge of legitimate praxis into dibal-ah, the perversion of justice, and kadibida, binding of the mouth. Many of the preserved examples of entering the palace rituals seek simply to calm anger, win friends, and influence people. Such doubtless had a long past and provably a bright future. Any number of formulae for success in business or litigation without really trying have come down to us in the PGM, a collection of Greek magical papyri from late antique Egypt. More aggressively, it was possible to take measures to directly counter the Dibal-A and Kadibida allegedly being practiced by the client's enemies. This was a slippery slope that inevitably led downwards to nastier and nastier magic, with occasional loss of any pretense to legitimacy. One ritual required a named figurine to be positioned covering its own mouth and anus with its hands. An iron spike was stuck in, and the lot was sealed into a little clay pot with seals of shubu stone and lapis. At the threshold of the client's gate, it was strewn over and then smashed under heel to make the client prevail in his case. Presentation of the figure to Shamash, god of justice, cast a cloak of legitimacy over what was essentially binding of the mouth magic, with the enemy actually unable to speak, or as one recitation puts it quite boldly, "Heavens, pay attention! Things of the earth, hear my voice, until I strike the cheek and tear out the tongue of my legal adversary, so-and-so, son of so-and-so. I will return his word to his mouth. His mouth will revolt against talking. I will not even allow him to fart." Most hair-raising was the practice of performing an actual anti-witchcraft ritual in which the standard pair of figurines of various substances were burned in a crucible while reciting a formula inviting the alleged sorcerer or sorceress to burn itself at the edge of legitimate praxis. This done, you mixed your opponent at court into the picture. To do this, you made a single figurine of your legal opponent from clay, twisted its arms behind its back, and sealed its mouth with seals of shubu stone and shadanu stone, presumably rolled at right angles to one another while reciting this edifying spell. You are the figurine of my adversary in court. I bound your arms. I put refuse in your epigastrium. I have seized your mouth for it not to say bad things about me. I have sealed your lips with a seal of shubu stone and shadanu stone, not to bring up my name. So far, and I said, we have essentially performed kadibida. But we're just getting started. The spell continues with an appeal to Marduk, literally, for perversion of justice. Asaluchi, exorcist of the gods, show me the overcoming of my adversary in court. Then I will praise your glory. To give a shadow of legitimacy to any of this, the client also presents the figurine to Shamash for trial, washes his hands over it before slipping it into the crucible with the other figures. So if the adversary in court was not really guilty, nothing terrible would happen to him, but he'd still lose his case, which will have been adjudicated in the meantime. And as if to confirm the sorcerous nature of the rite, the resulting triumph is supposed to be immediate. As soon as he has done this, he will quickly overcome his adversary. If one had to look for an actual text of real hard-boiled sorcery from ancient Mesopotamia, this would be it. There was also apparently a do-it-yourself without expert help conditional magic, which occasionally appears in the text. Namely, the practice of leaving a sorcerous animal package where the victim was sure to find it. This is readily recognizable as a means of enforcing local customary law without recourse to official courts. Does not follow that the victim of this sort of magic had no means of self-defense. The distraught discoverer of an Arabu rodent with its throat cut at his door was devised to give it a sort of burial, complete with anointing with oil, dressing up, wrapping in a little shroud of mouse skin, with bits of gold, silver, and semi-precious stones inside. The resultant package was quasi-mummified with unguents mixed with honey, milk, and wine, and given a final linen wrapping before being put in a tomb. Last but not least, the customary funerary offerings, eulogies, and other rites were to be performed for 7 days. In view of the fact that the sorcery in question was designed to make the victim die before his time, supposedly, what has actually happened is that the dead rodent has been given as a substitute for the victim who would otherwise have been the one for whom these rites would have been performed. In addition, the quasi-mummified animal corpse could serve as a sort of friendly, familiar spirit, protecting the counter-sorcerer against similar attack for the rest of his life. Simultaneously, it could be taken as making the nasty neighbor who put that rodent there the victim of his own magic. If you sought professional help to achieve similar ends, you had to make adjustments in order to keep on the right side of the law. An actual example of a defixio, which is just such a sort of legitimate, quasi-legitimate use of conditional magic, was discovered at Susa. At issue was a stolen object or a disputed piece of property. Text is unfortunately broken just as it gets to the good part. In any case, despite the apparent malice and dark talks of death and burial to befall a named individual, what the practitioner really wanted was to get satisfaction. So he went into a grave and laid a text spread out over 7 pieces round the corpse in a magic circle to force cooperation. He also promised offerings to netherworld gods and represented one of them in a pit to attend the proceedings. However, this is Elam and not Mesopotamia, and the netherworld gods are not only legitimate, but the great gods of the local pantheon. Even so, the whole thing is phrased as if it were an anti-witchcraft ritual. So, the enemy is alleged to be a sorcerer who plans undeserved death and destruction for the practitioner. The ghost is more or less politely invited to come up from the netherworld to its edge, from which vantage point he is recruited to travel to the netherworld and to argue the patient's case before the court of Napirisha. Okay. This is a cylinder seal that it's a rolling, I should say, a composite picture of a cylinder seal that was rolled on bullae. It was reconstructed by Holly Pittman and published in the Festschrift Porada. And I wish to thank her for this wonderful drawing. Okay, anyway, you can see who the people are. It's a mythological scene, but it shows my cast of characters. So there's Napiri-Shah in the middle, so you can see, and you have the Ishme-Karab, Shushanak, and Lagamal. They actually run behind in a row on the other side. The seal actually it should be rolled somewhat differently, imaginarily rolled somewhat differently. Okay, so the suit is successful and the ghost is imagined as very excitedly reporting back. What this means is that the alleged witch is now to suffer the evil deeds he contemplated for his alleged victim. A copy of the sealed verdict appears on one of the pieces. Next step is for 2 netherworld demons who act as bailiffs to take the road up to fetch the miscreant. They have Akkadian names in this text, Ishme-Karab and La-Gamal. The names indicate that they are respectively the one you have to thank for hearing your request for justice and the merciless carrier out of your verdict. The Elamite name of the latter was probably Shazi, son of the god of the water ordeal that could be used to determine guilt or innocence in an actual court of law, whereas Ishme-Karab is otherwise attested as a standing judge in the court of Napiri-Shah. Ishme-Karab and La-Gamal soon return, dragging the alleged sorcerer to his doom. And we are allowed to hear a private conversation, which we were denied hearing the first time round before they went off. Shushanak stands in a pit talking about the case, and what he says is said only to the darkened. When they come back, we get the full text, and it is I who led thither the black cloud. The black cloud in question is the soul of the alleged witch. The instructions follow for the entombment. Given are the threshold to drag him across, the stones to lay him on. May his wind be taken. May the rest of him be taken. Truly, your terror is poured out, O God of the lands. The wind in question is the soul of the deceased, which is blown away as part of the funeral ritual. The god addressed is Napiri-Shah, and a final request reveals what it was that this alleged victim actually wanted. Napiri-Shah heard, and as a result, he, the alleged witch, is destroyed until such time as whatever this is that's in dispute will have passed into the practitioner's possession. So, what if the victim does not do what he's supposed to do? Curtains for him. It is the furnace in the workshop of Shushanak, the watering place of Shushanak. The reference is to the classic anti-witchcraft practice of making figurines in a brazier and then quenching them with water. Magic does not work unless it is paid for, and our practitioner is perfectly willing to pay. Just, you know what, not quite yet. The spell ends with, I want to have brought a food portion, oil pressings and other items unbroken for the ghost. And I want to have performed a holocaust of sheep and barley for Ishme Karab and La Gamal. What the practitioner means is that he wants the ghosts and gods to make the alleged witch cough up whatever it was that was in dispute so that he would have the opportunity to show his thanks with appropriate offerings. Usually, in Mesopotamia at least, he would give the offerings up front with gratitude to follow. Here, the practitioner wishes to get his goodies before he gives his offerings. Do ut dem, I do because you have done, not do ut des, I do so that you will do. We have come to the end of our little survey. We have discussed the relationship between magic, religion, and science in ancient Mesopotamia. We have also seen actual examples of magic, good, bad, and conditional. I think we've done quite enough for one day. Thank you for your patience. Any questions?
Thank you so much for this inspiring lecture. It was a real pleasure to hear you.
Okay, good. Now I can be full screen again. So I'm ready to answer any questions that have come up in the course of the lecture.
I think you can just open your microphone and ask the questions. There were no written questions in the chat. Now we have one from Matthew. So just feel free to ask.
Hello?
Oh,
Yes?
sorry. Yeah, Akkadian Parisu equals Pharisee.
Mhm.
Is there more proof of that, or is there a reason why, I guess, that term would have, become known for this very famous set of Jewish people in the Hellenistic period?
Okay, to know is that before the Babylonian captivity, you had a fairly sizable Jewish community in Assyria who would be contemporary with this prayer. So the word that's used, there are two procedures that are used by a judge in judging a case in Mesopotamia. You have the Dinu Dayanu, normally called Dinu Danu, which is the actual judgment. So you're guilty, you're innocent. Then there's Parisu, Parasu, but the Parisu of Parusus, who decides whether there was anything actually done that was wrong. Okay, he did it, fine. And whether there should be a penalty, and if so, what penalty there should be imposed. And that is referred to as a separate process in Akkadian. It becomes separated in a number of legal systems, including the Roman legal system that come afterwards, and in the Islamic system as well as in Jewish law, between the person who makes the actual judgment and the person who gives a legal opinion that relates to the case. So what you're talking about then, my point is that the person who does the Parisu Parasu function in the system of Jewish law, the early part of it, okay, probably proto-Jewish actually at this point, was a Pharisee. And so the word is etymologized in Hebrew as coming from parasu, which is, it's that they're separate people, they're cut off, things like this. They make separations and things. They all rotate around the root parasu, and that is the root that is used to describe this thing, which is what they actually do. So it seems, okay, I don't have somebody, so-and-so the Pharisee, in Akkadian, which has the word parisu used, but apart from that, I think it's somewhat, circumstantial, but I think it's pretty close, particularly in view of the fact that this thing uses the Hebrew word, not the Akkadian word. It's shapatu and it's shapitu, which is not Akkadian. It is a loan word from Hebrew. So that strengthens the possibility that you have a cross-fertilization of cultures going on here.
Okay.
And lovely instrument you're playing.
Thank you so much. We have the next question here from Chris, may you just ask yourself?
Of course. Hello from Poland.
Ah.
I'm interesting for divination. According to you, divination is more magical or religious? Because about foreseeing the future in prophecy is the kind of magic, or there is science, or there is, it's for me difficult to say.
Okay, this is a topic of long standing discussion as to where divination actually places. There was actually an entire workshop on it at a fairly recent rencontre. As you know, I don't like to make hard and fast distinctions, as you probably heard, between magic, science, and religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what I would do with the divination question is to basically say yes. You know, it's whatever you want to see it as. I mean, the omens that you are divining from were set there in the sky or wherever they are were produced by gods. Okay, so there's a religious element to that. There's a scientific element to that that involves uncertainty principle, sort of the most basic level that it doesn't give certain answers. Okay, it gives, yeah, okay, and there are even places where you don't get an answer at all. There's something called Nipkat Bari where there's no consensus among the interpreters as to what this omen even means. So you have a very, and they make up new ones to try to fill in the gaps for things that do not naturally occur. So if we ever saw something like that, what would it be like? So in that regard, it's sort of, and now the magic does not come in the divination process itself. Where the magic arrives is when you're trying to get rid of the omen. And that actually takes two forms. There's you get rid of the negative omens by doing this Nomborbi process. If there's a positive omen, however, and the divination has been done by extispicy, you actually eat the meat of that. In other words, the person who asked for the omen to be divined actually will eat the meat. I know that because there is a disease which is caused by eating ill-omened meat. And I can't imagine what else ill-omened meat would be other than eating the meat of a sacrifice for divination purposes that resulted in a bad omen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. So you accept the omen, in other words, the good omen you accept by eating the meat. So there's a little bit of everything mixed. By the time you get through the whole process, and everybody's been involved. Oh, and as far as divination and prophecy, I have an article on the subject of the relationship between some forms of divination and prophecy, which is in one of the volumes published by the OI. I think it's actually on divination that was published in it's in free download. It's available. My husband could possibly send. It's Oriental Institute seminars. Look on the website, try to find the one. Everything from the OI is free, so you can have a free download and you can see what everybody else, including Marty Nissen and a few other people, had to say on the subject.
Okay, thank you a lot.
Right? Okay.
Thank you both. And we have another question. It's a little bit another topic. It's regarding the reincarnation beliefs in Mesopotamia. Steffi, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes. I know Irvin Finkel mentioned in his book that there was some texts that regard the possible belief in reincarnation based on different parts of the soul belonging in different places. And I was just wondering if you had read anything on that or had found anything yourself.
Okay. I've actually written on that subject. Souls do come back, but they don't come back the same. Okay, so you have we were talking about souls coming back, people who have died, then the soul actually, or part of the soul managing to come back. That does not actually happen in quite the way that we like to think about it. We're not talking about resurrection exactly. The Greek version, they drink from the river of Styx before they pass, and so they forget all their past lives. However, the Mesopotamian version, as I reconstructed it, the god Nergal essentially eats the souls that have reached their past their sell-by date, and then has intercourse with Ereshkigal, who gives birth to the new souls, and they then leave the netherworld, poled on a boat whose polar is the goddess Ishtar, and loaded onto the boat, which is the fetus, which has traveled in its mother to the netherworld for transmission into the birth, to the birth canal, basically, to be born. Okay, that's the full story.
Thank you.
From the Mesopotamian point of view, that's the full story. We have to wait a bit for resurrection properly. The closest you come to it is immortal, immortal gods. The planetary ones, they go to the netherworld and they come back, but it's once a year. And as I said, it's no biggie. They're not dying, and there's no such thing as a dying and recovering god. There are gods that die and stay down, but pay visits to the living. Those are the human ones that pay little visits to the living on occasion. And then you have the gods who, as I said, go to the netherworld and come back. And it's part of their cycle as a planet, basically.
2 souls.
And there are multiple souls in Mesopotamia. I should mention, yes, are we still, okay. I think that's the previous question, but there are multiple souls in Mesopotamia. That's certainly true. One of them doesn't go anywhere. And as said, the dream soul, the Zakiku, it just sort of becomes wind devils that they wander around in places. And it's them that Enlil controls. His etymology of his name is the Lord of the Zakiku. Winds, and those are Enlil's winds, and they're wind devils that destroy things. Okay, that's the Atemu is the body spirit, and it parts from the soul at death and persists until it gets recycled. Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry, I have one question.
Yes.
Studying the Syriac, me and my colleagues, we study the Syriac tradition of charms in
Yes.
classical Syriac language.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a very sort of down-to-earth question to compare with the previous one. And usually we have a combination of the incantations against snakes and scorpions.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask you, is there a Mesopotamian tradition to combine them together, or are they combined by natural cause, or is it traditional?
I'm trying.
Like, do you have incantations against both of them?
I think, yeah, I think the snakes and I'm thinking about treatments actually also. I think the snakes, don't cite me, I have to look it up, but I think that the snakes and scorpions go into the same category. Yeah. Of treatment. I think so.
Okay.
Although scorpion sting produces somewhat different results than the other. But at any rate, I think they are put together. There's more reasons than that for them to be associated.
If you have a reference, I will be happy to have it if you send me. Thank you.
And look up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. not now, obviously, but
Yes.
but
I
just
see. Yeah.
send me an
Thank you
email
very much.
and I can send you. Yes, we have snakes and I think we have snakes and scorpions. In any case, we have treatments.
So
for
we
them.
have an answer from another listener. You see, there are incantations against both snakes, scorpions, and dogs. Okay. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Mhm.
If I can just interject, just to say there is an article by Finkel on dog, snake, and scorpion incantations.
Right.
What is this AMD? What is this abbreviation?
Wait.
What's it? Ancient magic and divination.
Yes. Thank you.
Ancient magic
Thank
and
you.
divination.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There you
Okay.
go.
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes,
Thank you.
that's a wonderful article. Yes, I would highly
Yes,
recommend
yes,
that.
yes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, Joanne, thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing your research. It was a real pleasure to have you here. And thanks to all our listeners from all over the world. It's really great how we can gather here online during this unusual situation with no conferences, but with once or two times a week, months gathering online. it's great. I'm looking forward to the next lecture in this series, and I wish you a very nice evening, afternoon, or day according to your time zone.
Yes. If you are interested in other lectures of our seminar, you can watch our YouTube channel, which was created just a pair of days back. Yes, the link is in the chat. John, great thanks for your talk. It was very, very interesting.
Good. I'm glad you have.
At first, I thought that the topic is too broad, but every paragraph was very informative. Thank you.
Yes, right. It's jam-packed, as I said. That's why I wanted to make sure that I could start right on time. So, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, by the way, there is one thing I was thinking about the problem. I pulled this material that I used for this verbatim out of published articles of my own. I don't know what there might be a problem. Well, obviously the translations I don't have to reword, but some of the other material, I mean, some of it's verbatim sentences from various things. When I pulled this together, it's little things. I mean, presumably it comes under fair use, but that's something else. The other thing is, if you could find some way of cleaning up my stumblings, please. At my age, I can't always get my mouth to work.
Do you mean the problem of rights for publishing it online?
Is there such a thing? Is there such a thing? Anyway, whatever. I just to make sure that everything's. I don't want you guys to get in trouble or whatever about it. So yeah. I mean, my concern.
We can discuss it later, but I think usually if your presentation, I mean, if the audience is not like thousands or millions,
right, okay,
it doesn't matter too much.
Yeah.
So
okay. Fine. Very good.
Someone, yes, if someone applies to us, we can do something or stop this video or something like that.
Whatever.
I don't think, I don't
think
there will be only hundreds of viewers, not thousands. I am sure. Yes, even with your popularity. Okay, so I think we can stop now, and if you want, we can discuss it in letters.
Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Okay, so we were finished with questions. Is that
someone
right?
have a question? Sorry. No. Oh yeah. So
okay,
thank you for coming, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye bye.